right. Well, thank you so much for this invitation to speak to caregivers across BC. Thank you for attending today, and I look forward to any questions you might have and our discussion. So the topics for today that I will be reviewing are just touching on International Women's Day and the measurement of gender wage gaps, including in Canada, which will lead us into the discussion of intersectionality, and in particular, intersectional invisibility, and the different forms that this takes in the workplace, and the different ways in which people respond to it. And then we're going to have not discussion groups, but a discussion about these forms and responses. So hopefully you'll have an opportunity to digest this through reflecting on your own experiences. So International Women's Day has been around now for about 50 years. And it began in the turn of the century in Europe and North America, when there were pushes for women's suffrage and labor rights. And in 1911, there's a huge march across Europe marking the first International Women's Day on March 8th. And that's why it's on March 8th. And I know it's not March 8th today, but we're still kind of recognizing this issue throughout the month of March. And then the UN Commission on the Status of Women was created about 35 years later. And this is the first global intergovernmental body that is entirely dedicated to gender equality, and it still does a lot of work on this topic. And then International Women's Day was officially recognized by the United Nations, and so it's celebrated every year. I think that there's echo and feedback that people are noting in the chat, so I'm not sure how to address that or if it's coming from me. But I'll continue. Hopefully it's not too bad. And so there are attempts to measure gender equality across the world and to compare countries and their progress or their lack thereof. So the best known of these is the annual World Economic Forum Gender Gap Index, which was created in 2006 and is produced every year. And so this is a gender gap report that comes out every year, and it's available online for free. It's really fun to peruse, I think, because there's a lot of interesting information in it. And there's different measures of gender equality that go into an overall index of the gender gap across countries. So you can see on the left here, just up until Canada. So there's, well over 100 countries in this gender gap index and ranking, but I just clipped it at where Canada falls. So we might be surprised to think that Canada is at 32 overall. This includes health and survival, educational attainment, economic participation and opportunity, as well as political empowerment sub-indices that go into this overall one. So Canada's doing super well on, for example, educational attainment, but it's not doing as well on economic participation and opportunity and political empowerment, earning it a slightly lower ranking than some other countries. The US, as comparison, is at 42, so it's doing worse than Canada. But when we delve into Canada specifically, which I'm going to do in a minute, we start understanding a little bit more of that. So the biggest gaps across the world include economic participation and opportunity and politics. So politics is the worst. Women are not making many gains in the political realm, including in Canada, generally. But there's a lot of dispersion or variance across countries in these two sub-indices. So in educational attainment and health and survival, there's a lot of clustering toward the top because a lot of countries are doing well on that. But in economic and political equality, there's a lot of variance across countries. And I'll note that political empowerment and economic equality are highly correlated. So usually economic empowerment translates to political equality and vice versa. So I'm going to be drilling down into the economic gender gap in Canada a little bit before launching into a discussion of intersectionality in the workplace. So we see here that Canada is ranked 35 in gender inequality, in economic opportunity and participation. And then even within that, there are sub-indices. You can see here that wage equality for similar work, it's ranked at 43rd. So a lot of this is accounted for by the gender wage gap in Canada. And when we look at the gender wage gap in Canada by average weekly wage across all employees, that is employees working both part-time and full-time, age 15 and older in Canada, we see that there's very slow progress. So this is ranging from 1997 to 2025. So we go from just below 0.7 cents or 70 cents on the dollar for every dollar earned made by men is earned by women. So women earn an average of 70 cents for every dollar a man earns in Canada in 1997, and then just above 80 cents now in 2025. So very slow progress. This is often referred to as the stalled gender revolution. And we can also see that there was more progress made in the teens, I guess like 2015 or so, and then a little bit of regression after that. So how do we account for this gap? The biggest reason for this gap that statistical models can capture is the sex segregation of the workforce. So the fact that women and men are segregated into different sectors of the economy and different occupations within those sectors. So I think it's interesting to note that segregation is still very high. We've made some progress on desegregating, especially traditionally male occupations. And as women gain in education, they start entering some of those traditionally male domains, but other male domains are still largely closed off to them. And then men are also not flocking to traditionally female domains of the workforce. So sex segregation is still quite high. And the reasons for this are things that I have studied. So the sense of belonging and inclusion people experience in the workplace depends very much on whether or not the workplace is welcoming to their gender identity or other forms of identity. And so in addition to sex segregation, we also see a lot of racial segregation in the workplace, class segregation, and so forth. So people tend to cluster where they feel included and like they are welcomed and belong. So that contributes a lot to the wage gap and inequality. Men also tend to work longer hours than women. And so overtime, as well as more full-time work can account for some of this. So when we look at full-time workers, the wage gap overall is around 90 cents on the dollar. And then women's relatively low unionization is another reason for the gap. So men tend to be in sectors that are unionized more so than women, and unionization tends to correspond to higher wages. So some of the closing of the wage gap is due to the deunionization of men's work in Canada. But even accounting for everything that we can throw into a regression equation to try to explain the gender wage gap, such as the sector of employment, the occupation, the hours worked, whether you're in a unionized workplace, the safety and the comfort of the work that is performed, or the level of education, marital status, or experience of the worker, about 2/3 of the gap is still unexplained. So this is where conversations about discrimination come into place, or different terms and conditions of employment. Within the same occupations and sectors, women on average earn a lot less than men. There's still the wage gap within the same jobs. So that's evidence of some wage discrimination going on. So that unexplained variance is of interest to us sociologists and social scientists. Now, when we look at the gender wage gap in Canada by population group, we see interesting patterns as well. So it's not just a matter of looking at the average earnings of women versus men. When you start breaking this down further by national origin or ethnic and racial identities, you start seeing a big racial gap as well, a combined racial and gender gap. So you see that this dark line here in the graph is women's wages relative to white Canadian-born men. So if we take white Canadian-born men as the standard against which we are comparing different groups of women's wages, we see that white women fare the best. So they're making just above 70 cents on the dollar. This is a different analysis that was done from statistics taken in 2016. So the numbers might be slightly different than what I presented earlier. And this is also collapsing across full-time and part-time workers. And then you see the decline in relative women's wages depending on which group they belong to, with women from Arab and West Asian backgrounds earning the least in Canada, but a big drop from white and East Asian to Black women, and then it kind of flattens out. So this is a pattern that is often not really studied or revealed. Canada doesn't tend to gather statistics as much on these different population groups, and instead tends to focus more on the gender gap. So this was good to come across. And then there's also more recent data that is comparing people with bachelor's degrees, so people who have graduated from university, and looking at how much they make 2 years after graduation. So this is from statistics in 2021, and we can see income gaps were collapsing across different population groups here to just describe non-racialized men, non-racialized women, and racialized women. But just 2 years after the bachelor's degree, there's quite an income gap already. And as we know, these income gaps tend to compound over time. And even when controlling for graduate characteristics, such as what people majored in, the grades, the universities they attended, these income gaps persist. And again, we see that among women, West Asian and Arab graduates have the largest income gaps. You can't see it in this figure, but that is the case in the overall analysis that was conducted for this report, earning about 16% less than non-racialized and non-Indigenous women. Okay, so we see that these patterns really differ by gender and race, and that's why it's really important to take a more intersectional approach to understanding these patterns in the workforce and women's experiences. So this picture from the pandemic, I hope does not trigger bad memories. This was a very stressful time, but it was also a time in which nurses were recognized for the heroes that they are, and healthcare workers were recognized as essential. And we also see a lot of diversity in healthcare workers, but we still have about 78% in British Columbia being female. Okay, so the concept of intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw back in 1989, where she was asked to be an expert witness on a case in which a woman, a Black woman, was suing General Motors because they wouldn't hire her. And the judge ruled that, well, she wasn't discriminated against because General Motors hired women and General Motors also hired Black men. And so there wasn't evidence of sexual or racial discrimination at General Motors. What was interesting, however, is that it was only white women that General Motors hired, and it was only Black men that General Motors hired, but they did not hire Black women. And so this really revealed the issue of the intersection of race and gender, and how if you belong to two marginalized groups, you are often overlooked. Because whenever we talk about a marginalized identity, we tend to talk about it in the singular. So we just talk about gender with the exclusion of race. And then we take the default category or the privileged identity within gender, that is white women, and we make that the focus of gender. When we talk about Black people, then the focus will be on men, Black men. But Black women are often left out of the conversation, as are racialized women in general. So Crenshaw joined other scholars that were echoing similar concerns to argue that race and gender are usually treated as mutually exclusive categories in our theories and our analysis of data, but we really have to look at their combined interlocking identities and how they form unique experiences for people. You can't just add gender and race and then get Black women's experiences, as seen in that case that she was an expert witness on. And so I like this quote: "If we can't see a problem, we can't fix a problem." This is from a TED Talk she gave in 2018 about this ongoing issue of not seeing racialized women. Now, this not seeing comes from social power structures. So individuals encounter multiple and overlapping forms of oppression, and these experiences are shaped by power structures that are embedded in society, politics, and the economy. So we have gendered power structures and roles, we have racial powered structures and roles, we have class power structures and roles, etc. And so when we start thinking about any given individual, everyone has a gender, everyone has a race, everyone belongs to a class, everyone has an age, a sexuality, an ability level, etc. But so you cannot separate out these experiences like we tend to do. And so intersectionality as a theoretical lens recognizes this fact that each person has a unique combination of interlocking identities, and these shape a singular experience based on these identities, and social justice problems overlap to create multiple levels of disadvantage for those who belong to multiple marginal identities, such as gender and race. Now, from social psychology, we know that people pay attention to power. So there's a lot of social psychological research showing that, we pay attention to those that we think are influential or important in a given context. And so people with high power and status, or from high power and status groups, receive more attention, and they are also individuated and differentiated. So what does this mean? This means that when we are paying attention to somebody in a high power or status position or group, we think of them as an individual. We pay attention to their quirks and their likes, and we don't lump them in with other people. We see them as a unique entity. When we look at their groups, we tend to differentiate the people within that group. So we, for example, don't, the United States is a more powerful country in the world compared to, let's say, Iran. So we have this conflict going on. And people will not think of all Americans as the same. They will recognize that some Americans are nice and egalitarian, or voted this way or didn't vote that way, etc. But people might tend to just lump everybody in a more marginalized country in the world together and see them as all alike. This is true for groups within society as well. So high power groups or high status groups, racialized groups or non-racialized groups tend to be more differentiated than low power ones. So we tend to just lump everybody in a low power or status group together and think of them in more stereotypical terms and not differentiate them as individuals. Another interesting phenomenon is that when somebody high in power or status or with a privileged identity performs well, we tend to essentialize that performance. We tend to attribute that performance to their brilliance or their essentialized ability. Whereas when someone low in power and status performs well, we tend to make other attributions, external attributions for that, such as, well, they worked really hard or they got lucky. Or we just tend to overlook it due to confirmation bias. We pay attention to those things that confirm our pre-existing ideas and assumptions. But when somebody high in power and status performs poorly, we tend to excuse that poor performance or find external attributions for it, like, oh, well, they were having a bad day, they were under a lot of pressure, or we just overlook it. Whereas people low in status and power or low in privilege, we tend to essentialize that low performance. So, well, we knew they weren't very good at it to begin with. Okay, so that's to say, this is just sort of part of our cognitive brain structures that we pay more attention to people high in power and status. And we have to work to overcome those implicit biases. Now, the concept of intersectional invisibility comes from this idea that people do tend to pay attention to higher privileged identities, and thus they tend to overlook people with marginalized identities, especially multiple marginalized identities. So people with multiple marginalized identities are more likely to go unseen, unheard, and to be overlooked. So one study on facial recognition software actually found that facial recognition software has this bias built into it so that it cannot see darker skinned women. So when the face is a white man, facial recognition software identifies it 99% of the time accurately, but it goes all the way down to 65% for dark-skinned women. And then other social psychology studies show that facial recognition in people demonstrates the exact same pattern, that people are not as good at recognizing and remembering the faces of dark-skinned women compared to white-skinned men and other groups. All right. This quote from a domestic worker captures this phenomenon of feeling unseen and how much that feeling unseen is also a feeling of being dehumanized. It was this aspect of servitude I found to be one of the strongest affronts to my dignity as a human being. These gestures of ignoring my presence were not, I think, intended as insults. They were expressions of the employer's ability to annihilate the humanness and even at times the very existence of me, a servant and a Black woman. So a lot of people experience this phenomenon of being invisibilized as a very dehumanizing experience. So former graduate student of mine, Barnini Bhattacharya, who is now a professor at Western University in the Ivy School of Business, conducted a study of intersectional invisibility in Canada and how women of color experienced intersectional invisibility in the workplace. So Barnini interviewed 65 racialized women working in Canada, and this included women from South Asian, East Asian, Black, Latina, Middle Eastern, Southeast Asian, and Indigenous backgrounds and identities. 40% of them were immigrants. They ranged in age from 22 to 51, and they were split between the corporate and public sectors. And she conducted in-depth semi-structured interviews that lasted from 40 minutes to 3 hours. So a lot of the time, these were cathartic interviews. And she did not ask them directly about their experiences of invisibility. She didn't start it out that way. She would just get them talking about their experiences at work, and found that spontaneously almost every woman brought up this phenomenon of feeling invisible in the workplace. That this was a very universal experience. Here's one quote from the study that captures kind of in strong terms how this feels. It wasn't even so much about disliking what I did or being judgmental of what I did. It was a different kind of problem that I'd faced, not to be acknowledged. They didn't care. There was no curiosity. They didn't give a F. We were invisible. Forget judging you as good or bad. People were like, we don't give a S about you. Okay. Now, throughout these interviews, 4 different types of invisibility emerged. So the first one was the kind of direct definition of invisibility, erasure. So this is just being unseen and unheard. This might include, not being heard in a meeting, or just being completely overlooked, such as this quote. I remember being at the kiosk and this person came up. I asked him, can I help you? And he still didn't acknowledge me at all. And he spoke to this person behind me. I didn't know how to react. They didn't say anything to you. They just didn't acknowledge you. It's like you don't exist. Another experience of invisibility was homogenization. So this is, linking back to the social psychological research on stereotyping members of low status groups or treating them as interchangeable members, lumping them all together. So confusing them for one another is one form of homogenization, as told by this 30-year-old Black program coordinator. I am always mixed up with other Black women. My colleague who is from Senegal, we always get mixed up for each other. People think they're talking to her when they're talking to me or vice versa. Or they think they met me when they actually met her. It's ridiculous. And people have a lot of trouble with my name, which I have been forgiving about. I'm like, okay, it's an unfamiliar name. It's fine. But what really gets me is when people don't even make an effort to say it. They will not even try to pronounce it. It's like, this is so different and alien to me that I can't even engage with it. So that experience of being mixed up for another woman from a similar racialized group, or of having your name forgotten, mispronounced over and over, kept coming up in examples of homogenization. Another type of invisibility, which tended to occur to women who were slightly higher in status, such as middle managers, or who were not immigrants but had grown up in Canada, was that of whitening. So this is when their similarities to white culture was either just assumed, such as it was assumed that they celebrate the same holidays, or have the same interests and hobbies, or was praised. So they were praised for being white or Canadian, which was often used interchangeably with white. And their cultural and ethnic background was largely ignored. So one example of this is, one of the things my colleagues always said to me was that I was super easy to work with because I was familiar with their culture. It was just the soft aspects. That was always the feedback I got in comparison to some of my other Indian colleagues. Being able to do something on the weekend that others can relate to. You're kind of in a vulnerable place, which you don't want, of showing and sharing and saying that this is normal for us Indians, which is hard to do. So she was talking about how it was hard to bring up those things that she did that was not consistent with white culture, that there was almost a willful unseeing of that, and a focus on wanting to just be quote unquote colorblind, but colorblind is treating somebody as white in order to see them fully as human. And then the final type of invisibility was exoticization. So this is unique race and gender-based sexual objectification and fetishization. This occurred quite a bit, especially in younger women in the sample. And so this is sort of a form of sexual harassment, but it is uniquely racialized. So an example is, I'm also considered very exotic. People have said to me so many times, a Caucasian man came up to me and goes, "You're so exotic." And I was like, I come from a tropical forest. I'm a fruit. So different forms of this sort of treating women as exotic beings made women feel invisible because they felt that their individuality and their humanity was very much erased by this kind of treatment. Another woman who was from an indigenous background described being treated as Pocahontas, or some kind of a conquest by colleagues. So this was also a very painful form of not being seen. Okay, so how did women respond to these experiences? There were different response pathways. So depending on how ambiguous the behavior was or being invisibilized was, they tended to respond differently. So erasure was often more ambiguous because it wasn't clear what the intention of the person not seeing you or not hearing you was, or whether you just didn't speak up enough, etc. Same with whitening. That was often framed as, well, this is sort of a weird compliment, I guess, but it's also erasing my identity, or it's not a compliment. But the intentions of the person are very ambiguous. And because of that, women grappled with more ambiguous experiences and tended to blame themselves more for them or for their reactions to them, leading to shame and leading to sort of shutting down, not doing anything about it, or avoiding the person who made them feel that way, or the context in which they felt that way. Experiences that were less ambiguous, like homogenization, somebody always getting your name wrong, or mixing you up with someone else, or exoticization, making a comment about being exotic, were more obvious, and they were more obvious forms of racial bias. And so these tended to trigger anger. And when it was safe to do so, it triggered active resistance. So sometimes speaking up about these experiences to the person perpetrating them. So here's an example of shutting down. So when somebody feels erased, they might feel shame and shut down. Oftentimes what I say is not even in the minutes of the meeting. And I'm like, I think I spoke, or I think I said something. I'm included in emails where I agree with something that I didn't even talk about, to which I fundamentally actually disagree with. I shut down and I get mad at myself. There's shame attached to it. And sometimes I actually go to the person and tell them how I feel, but more often I shut down. That's the thing I'm constantly negotiating. I don't speak up enough. I have things to say, but I don't always say them. And this goes back to the self-anger. And so this sort of internal emotional labor she's doing and the questioning she's doing for herself is often leading her to shut down. And then the second response is active resistance. So an example from being homogenized is, people get my name wrong all the time. Even now, I have worked with a coworker for 2 years and she still says my last name wrong. Come on, it's on the announcements every Tuesday. I hate it when they get my name wrong. And there's another brown woman that works at my school and they mix us up all the time. I've been there for 4 years and it always happens. I'm like, wrong brown person. They're super embarrassed afterwards. They better freaking be super embarrassed. It makes me angry. I also laugh a little bit, but seriously, do not get us mixed up. I am me. I am not her. I am just like, that is not my name. And so that's an example of active resistance saying wrong brown person. Of course, active resistance comes with the danger of backlash. So a lot of women, especially those who did not feel empowered to resist, just shut down instead, even in cases of homogenization. Now, there was a third response pathway that was practiced by a few women, and these were women who had over the years started understanding the dynamics of invisibility as structural. So they'd gotten over the blaming of the self and recognizing this as something that happened to a lot of women in their position. So it wasn't their fault. And they also recognized that it wasn't necessarily intentional on the part of the person doing it, because it was a structurally based phenomenon. And so they would engage in pragmatic tactics to build connection and resist invisibility. So one example of this was, I've been trying to be more true to myself, just being like, when you ignored me and my cultural differences, I felt confused and upset. You're choosing not to recognize that I'm a woman of color that has all these experiences that come with it. When I say that, people are like, oh, wow, I didn't mean it at all. I just meant that everyone should be treated equally. And I'll say, well, let's unpack that. What does equal mean? What's equal for you might be different from what's equal for me because I'm a brown woman and you're a white woman. Usually having conversations like that go really well, and it helps build emotional connections, but the emotional labor is always mine. So as you can sort of glean from this quote, this is a woman who's quite well aware and understanding of the dynamics and articulate and able to speak up for her experience and explain it to the person, and also brave and or in a safe context where she's not afraid of professional backlash as much. And she might expect that the other person is more open to hearing or learning about her experience. Okay, so to summarize, people with marginalized identity, lower in status and power, are not seen. So this isn't just racialized women, but it is particularly racialized women. This is a structural phenomenon and a generalized cognitive pattern. And responses range to shutting down to anger to radical honesty, depending on people's feelings of safety, power, and awareness in the situation. And these social dynamics tend to further marginalize and invisibilize those who are unseen. So the sole exception here is radical honesty when it works, and a receptive or non-defensive other, open to learning and committed to connection. So we can all work on that receptivity, non-defensiveness, and being open to learning and committed to connection. And when we are invisibilized, work on learning how to engage with radical honesty when it is safe to do so. So we can create more inclusive environments and equal outcomes when people feel seen and accepted for who they are and belong. And we can diversify our workplaces and make them more inclusive for everyone if we get better at doing this. This will also help desegregate our work environments in addition to making them more pleasant. So that is all I have for the presentation, and I would like to engage in some discussion around, or give you the opportunity to talk about whether you've ever felt invisible at work, and how did it make you feel if you did, and what did you do about it? So probably all of us, no matter what our identities are, have felt invisible at times, and this might often be in situations in which we were relatively less powerful or marginalized than others. And then also, have you ever done things that may make others feel unseen? So again, we've all done this, so were you aware of it at the time? And what, if anything, did you do about it? Okay, so I'll open it up for discussion and also just general discussion. Any questions that you have? Oh, I
I'm
think
on
you're
mute.
on
Yeah. So
mute.
you could put your responses in the chat right now, if you want to discuss, or if you had any general questions for Jennifer. Um, we'll look at the Q&A in the chat right now.
I was originally hoping to break you into discussion groups for this because I think it's easier to discuss in a small group setting than it is in a big webinar format like this. So if you don't feel like sharing your own experiences, that's totally understandable.
Perhaps, Jen, maybe you could share an experience of yours, or perhaps
That I can do what?
you could share an experience of yours, perhaps.
Well, after conducting this study with Barnini, I just became much more aware of my own contribution to the problem. And one experience that I had was going to Harvard for this Harvard Business School conference of women and men who focus on gender diversity, racial diversity in the workplace. And I hadn't seen a lot of the people at that conference for a really long time. And it had been years. And so I went up to one woman, a Black female scholar who very, very prolific, well-known Black female scholar, and talked to her about her having been on one of my students' dissertation committees and thanking her for that. And then left and went and sat at my table and realized I had mixed her up with somebody else, another Black female scholar. And I was just mortified. I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't know how to apologize. And this was even after we had done this study. And so I followed up with an apology to both her as well as the woman I mixed her up for, and acknowledged the mistake and, you know, the systemic problem, I guess, that it came from, but also how I had failed to do better.
It's definitely a powerful example for sure. Someone said in the chat, I've definitely experienced invisibility in my life as a woman with a visible disability.
Yeah, that is one thing that I don't think the literature has done enough on. The focus has often been on race and gender, but disability is the number one human rights complaint made in British Columbia by quite a bit. So that appears to be a really pernicious basis of discrimination and human rights violations in the workplace within British Columbia.
There was someone else, maybe you could speak to this, generational gaps. I feel that generational gaps are creating more invisibility in the workspace um, at all, but also more transparency. The younger generation may be more likely to engage in quote unquote radical honesty, some may say. However, the concept of feeling invisible is all too real. Both older men lacking respect for young women and women of older generations alike. This has created a perpetual sense of quote unquote imposter syndrome, some may say.
Yeah, I think, and I hope you're right, that younger generations are doing a better job with radical honesty. I certainly think they're more aware of this is a structural problem, and perhaps equipped to talk about it. But older generations do really stand in the way, and they're the ones that hold the reins of power. So change is very, very slow. I think we just need to educate those people better.
100%. Education is a powerful tool, right?
Yeah.
Someone said, I once had an entire conversation with someone who asked the sighted person I was with all the questions, and I had answered every single question. At that time, I was much younger and not confident enough to say, please direct your questions towards me.
Wow.
Hmm.
That's a very powerful example of literally being treated as invisible, like you're not even there to answer the question or to be spoken to directly. And then also confusing one disability for another, just sort of lumping you into a erased category. Thank you for sharing that example. It's a very painful one.
In those circumstances, Jen, what would you recommend for, like, per se, like that example for that person?
It really depends on the circumstance and, who's doing the ignoring or overlooking, and what the consequences would be for standing up to them. I'm a firm believer in not blaming the victim. A lot of people, when they are discriminated against, harassed, or invisibilized, shut down or don't do anything about it for good reason. They're taking in a lot of different variables and information and doing probably a strategic calculation about their safety. But then kick themselves often afterwards for not doing more, but it's very understandable why they didn't in the moment. So, again, if you do feel safe enough to do so, or brave enough to do so, speaking up and trying radical honesty, it's so hard, right? Because you're supposed to thread that needle of not showing anger, not being accusatory, emphasizing connection and understanding, and sort of the unwitting nature of the blindness of the other person, the figurative overlooking, that is, of you. And so I think it's also important to, after you have enough of these experiences, sadly, you start recognizing how in the moment it seemed safer not to do anything about it, but then afterwards it eats at you. So if you start recognizing that it's going to eat at me if I don't speak up now, even though it's scary to speak up now, I'll be prouder of myself. I'll feel like I was more true to myself if I do something now, and overcoming that fear, I think can be really powerful, especially if you're able to do it, in a way that keeps you safe, or relatively safe, and helps the other person learn. I do think the bystander here also has a role to play. So the sighted person that was receiving all the questions, while allowing you to, Karen in the chat, to answer all the questions, could have perhaps intervened in some way to say, thank you for asking me the question, but Karen is the person to whom you should be directing all these questions. She's the expert. Again, you have to be sensitive to the way the person being invisibilized will receive that intervention, and you don't want to, overstep your role in the scenario. But if the bystander knows you really well, then they can also play a role in standing up for what's going on.
Someone asked in the Q&A, do you feel there is a fine line between making someone feel unseen for their differences compared to making them feel seen for their differences a little too much? And when does it slip into tokenism?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because there's this sort of two-sided coin of being hyper visible and being invisible. And it is easy to slip between the two, paying too much attention to difference. I would say really centering the other and letting them feel safe expressing whatever aspects of their unique cultural background or identity they feel like expressing, instead of presuming it for them, instead of trying to perform and demonstrate your knowledge and your ability to see them for who they are. Not falling into the savior complex and sort of putting the spotlight on them and their identity, but falling more into the ally or friend role, and giving space, right, for them to define that is a better approach.